Well, all right. I think we actually may go ahead and get started. We've had a lot already join us. And so why don't we go ahead and be as prompt as possible and kick off our May Lunch and Learn. And I want to thank Erin Williams in advance for being here with us. And I will give an introduction to Erin in just a minute. But hopefully I see some familiar names coming in. Hopefully this is a return to our Lunch and Learn series for many of you. And if not, this is a monthly series that we've started offering to provide education on different topics related to oncology care. And so we hope you'll join us in the future. I do want to note that we are recording this so that you can receive a copy for future reference. So you will get that sent to you by email, probably sometime early next week to mid next week. So you'll have a copy of the recording and Erin's slides as well. So you'll have everything you need in front of you at that point in time. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. We want this to be as interactive and informational as possible. Erin is not able to provide direct medical advice on specific questions that you may have on enrolling in trials, but we'll very much try to answer general questions and get you any information possible if things come up. So with all of that now said, let's go ahead and kick off, Erin. So I am again thrilled to welcome Erin Williams. Erin is the director of our Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center Clinical Research Operations and administrative director for the Clinical Research Office at UT Southwestern Harold C. Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center. Ms. Williams has a bachelor's degree of Bachelor of Arts in Biology from the University of Texas at Austin, and a master's degree in Business Administration with a focus on entrepreneurship from the University of Texas at Dallas. She has co-authored numerous publications in the field of clinical research and strategies toward minority accrual to clinical trials, and is a frequent speaker at national meetings and conferences. Ms. Williams is a member of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, the Association of American Cancer Center Institutes, Cancer Clinical Research Innovation, the Lilly Oncology Diversity Advisory Board, and has served a three-year term on the steering committee for AACI-CRI. Ms. Williams is responsible for directing, managing, and overseeing all administrative and financial operations associated with oncology clinical trials conducted at UT Southwestern Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center. And in her personal time, Ms. Williams sits on the board of the Down Syndrome Guild of Dallas and likes to spend time outside with her family. So Erin, thanks so much. We're going to turn it over to you. Especially, this is a great topic because May is National Cancer Research Month. So thanks so much for presenting for us.
Thank you, Alex. Can you hear me okay? All right. So thanks everyone for joining. As Alex mentioned, my name is Erin Williams. I am the Director for Clinical Research Operations at the Simmons Cancer Center. And in that role, I oversee all cancer-related clinical trials here at UT Southwestern. I'm excited to welcome you to this talk today and provide some information about clinical trials. I know there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of facts out there, there's a lot of information you can find on the internet. Sometimes the internet is our friend, sometimes it's not. So I'm here to try to glean some information for you. And again, as Alex mentioned, there's going to be a lot in this talk and some links and things like that I'm not going to go into great detail on, but we are going to provide for you next week so that you can kind of click through and take a look at some of the resources that I'll tell you about as we go forward. So as I mentioned, today we're going to focus on the importance of clinical trials, and specifically as it relates to cancer clinical trials. Cancer clinical trials are unique. They are complicated. We are treating patients with cancer with treatments that are either new, novel, or in new or novel combinations. So there's a lot of moving parts. But they are the key to developing new methods of prevention, detection, and treatment for cancer. Clinical trials allow us to determine if new treatments are safe and effective, if they work better than current treatments. Some trials involve treatments before surgery, could be after surgery, could not involve surgery at all. And a lot of trials will involve what we call combined modalities, right? So we might have drugs, we might have radiation, we might have surgery, we might do quality outcomes. So all sorts of different things that we're looking at when we do clinical trials in cancer. All cancer treatments used today are the results of past clinical trials. And that's really important to remember as we go through this talk and I tell you about the developments. This all came from clinical trials. So they do lead to exciting developments, and some of the more recent developments in cancer care, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, are that we're now targeting cancer tumors. So you probably have a memory of, when the only treatments for cancer were chemotherapy. Chemotherapy targets rapidly dividing cells. We know that tumors are rapidly dividing cells, so it makes sense. But we also have a lot of other rapidly dividing cells in our body. And so that chemotherapy creates toxicity related to that. So your hair, your nails, your skin, your digestive system, things like that. So these more recent developments are really important. They're important in providing additional opportunities to target the cancer and do a better job at controlling it. And they can be used in combination with chemotherapy. And as you might imagine, if we're just targeting the cancer tumor, like these first two rows that I'm talking about, cancer cells make abnormal proteins. Some cancers have specific mutations in the cancer that make them grow. If we can target those aspects of the tumor, then we have less impact on our body's normal cells or our typical cells. And we can have less side effects for those treatments. So those treatments were a really important development. And really up until the last 10 or 15 years, those were kind of the thing. But more recently, we've gotten even more innovative in really helping our body fight cancer. So when cancer is able to grow, it means that our bodies are not recognizing that abnormality in our system. And that's a problem, obviously. So over time, we've developed some drugs called treatment called immune therapy, and some of the drugs are listed there in that third row. And these drugs are really intended to further activate the immune system, to tell the immune system what it's supposed to do. And one of the more recent and most exciting development is this cellular therapy, or CAR T. And as I mentioned, next week, you'll get access to these slides and you can take a look at this article that was written about a recent trial that we did here at UT Southwestern. You'll see some references to that later. But I'll try to be brief about it, just give you a little bit of detail about how CAR T works, because it's pretty cool. But essentially what it's doing is it's actually taking the patient with cancer, taking their T cells through a procedure called apheresis. We take your tumor fighting cells, your antibody cells out of your body. We send them to a laboratory. We re-engineer them. We show them what they're supposed to target. We tell them what they're supposed to do. Then we send them back. We put them back in the body of the person with cancer, and those cells now know what they're supposed to do, and they know what tumors they're supposed to target, and they're going to go and fight that cancer. So it's super interesting, all of this cutting edge research and all this cutting edge therapy that we have access to because of clinical trials. But how do clinical trials really work? And that's really what we're here to focus on today. So you might have heard of the phases of clinical trials. So clinical trials come most often in 3 phases. There actually is a 4th phase. The 4th phase is generally a post-approval trial. So after the FDA, for example, might approve a drug for a treatment in a particular type of cancer, it may be that we need to follow patients for a long time to learn all of the potential side effects or long-term effectiveness of that drug. And so we call those a phase 4, or like a post-market study. But what we focus on primarily at the Simmons Cancer Center is phase 1, phase 2, which we consider early phase clinical trials, and phase 3 trials. So I'll walk you through that a little bit. So phase 1 trials. These trials are designed to tell us if the drug is going to be safe or the treatment is going to be safe in the patient. And it's also designed to tell us what is the maximum dose we can give while still keeping the patient safe. We're not going to keep patients free of side effects, but we want to make sure that the drug is tolerable and that the treatment is tolerable enough for the patient to get through the treatment, right? If you can't get through the treatment, it can't be effective. So in early phase 1 trials, we're talking very small numbers, like 15 to 30 patients, very kind of slow and methodical trials, 1 patient at a time getting enrolled to that trial, looking at how the drug works in that patient, if it's safe, if it's causing minimal toxicity, and then we can sort of kind of go up from there. In the phase 2 setting, if we establish that the treatment is safe and we establish that we think it might have some effectiveness, we think we're at a dose that is good enough to take it forward to phase 2, then we're going to take it into phase 2. Phase 2 are going to be slightly larger trials, like 50 to 100 people. This is where we're really looking and designing the trial to tell us whether it's effective. So all of the patients generally participating in a phase 2 trial are getting what we call the investigational treatment or the experimental treatment. We don't really like the word experiment too much when we're talking about people and trials. But when we talk about investigational treatment, everyone in a phase 2 trial is generally getting that investigational treatment so we can see if it's effective. One thing I didn't mention, I just want to circle back to, in a phase 1 trial, as a participant, as a patient participating in a phase 1 trial or any trial, we're always monitoring whether that drug is effective in you as the cancer patient. If a drug stops working for you, you will be taken off that trial and we will try to give you something else. So while the trial might only be designed to look at safety and in a particular patient population, it doesn't mean that we're going to have patients on the trial despite the fact that the drug might not be working. We're always monitoring whether the drug is working in individual patients. But these are the different phases. And quite frankly, phase 1 trials are just too small for us to tell in a wide population whether they're going to be effective. So that's why we go through the next 2 phases. And that brings me to phase 3. So phase 3 is where we're really looking at, is it better than what we currently have? So in the phase 2 setting, probably all the patients are getting the investigational treatment, and they may or may not be getting the standard of care treatment, but we know they're all getting the investigation. We're seeing a signal. It looks like it's working okay. Now we need to get it in an even bigger patient population, and we need to compare it to what we already have. Does it work the same? Does it work better? Does it work worse? Right? And so a lot of times these trials are randomized. So some of the patients participating in a phase 3 trial might be getting the investigational drug, and some of the patients might be getting the standard of care, or we might do it in combination where some patients are getting the investigational treatment plus the standard of care, and the other patients are just getting the standard of care. Really importantly, also in cancer clinical trials, you're always getting the usual care or the treatment. We'll talk about that more in a minute. That kind of takes us through the phases of clinical trials. One other point of clarification before I move on, because this question gets asked, are the phases of clinical trials, like if I'm a participant, am I moving through those phases? And the answer is no. So if you're participating in a phase 1 clinical trial, that's your trial. If the drug or the treatment moves into the phase 2 setting, that's a completely different trial, and it'll have a completely different set of patients. So that's a question that comes up a little bit sometimes when we're talking about phases. So how do we develop clinical trials here? And how do we know that the clinical trials that we have open at the Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center are trials that we want for our patients? So there's a number of reviews that we do just internally. So trials can be developed at UT Southwestern by the Simmons Cancer Center, by our physicians. We call them physician investigators or investigator-initiated clinical trials. And trials can be developed by pharmaceutical companies or other investigators at other institutions. So we have the opportunity here to participate in trials that we've developed, and we also participate often in trials that others have developed outside of UT Southwestern. So whenever we get all of these trials into our door, we get a number of trials into the pipeline, we have to make decisions about what trials are going to move forward. And to do that, we have disease-oriented teams, and those disease-oriented teams are looking at all of the trials that come in to make sure they're feasible and to make sure they fit the portfolio and sort of the pipeline of what we want to give to our patients. In addition, as an NCI designated comprehensive cancer center, we are required to have our own scientific review body. We call it the Protocol Review and Monitoring System. And that's a scientific committee review that reviews all cancer-related clinical trials at UT Southwestern. And they're just double checking and making sure that these protocols seem scientifically sound, that they're well designed, and that they're designed to answer the questions that they're posing. Some trials might come out positively and where they were designed to test if this investigational treatment worked better, and lo and behold, it does, and that's great news. Some trials can be negative where we find out that the investigational treatment did not work as well as what we already have. But those can still be well-designed trials. A trial that is not well designed won't tell us either answer. And that's a big waste of everybody's time. And most importantly, it's a big waste of your patient's time, right? You don't have time to participate in a trial that's not going to drive answers and going to drive science. And not only that, but we don't want to expose you to that kind of risk, because trials do come with risk. And that brings me to the ethical and the safety committees that we have. So every clinical trial operation anywhere has to report to an institutional review board. That institutional review board is an independent body. We have one at UT Southwestern that reviews all of the we call it human subjects research. That's not a really nice term, but all of our clinical trials that go through the institutional review board, and they're looking at the potential risks of the trial. They're comparing that to the potential for benefit. That could be benefit to the patient that's participating, and or benefit at large, right? The benefit to the population. And they're making sure that those things are balanced and that they feel like we have a plan that's going to keep our patients safe. And only once a trial gets through all 4 of these steps does it even think about getting open here. So it's a lot. It can be a long road for a trial sometimes, but it's a really important one. So let's talk a little bit through some of the frequent questions that we get. So these questions on the slide are questions that my research coordinators and my research teams get very frequently. Will I get a placebo? What are the costs? Is this my last hope? Is this everything? Is that why you're asking me to take part in a clinical trial? Is this going to take more of my time? And what are the risks? And I'm going to take some time over the next several slides to kind of walk you through that too. So first, will a trial take more time? Probably it can. So in cancer, generally speaking, we are doing things with you while you're participating in a clinical trial that are similar to what you would do if you weren't in a clinical trial. You're still coming to our center, you're still seeing the physician, you're still getting some sort of treatment for your cancer. So there's a lot of things that are the same. But there's a lot of additional things that we tend to do in clinical trials that can make the day take longer. For example, we might add an observation period after we give you the investigational treatment. We want to make sure that you're going to respond to that treatment, that you're not going to have a bad reaction to that treatment. So we may keep you for an hour or more after you get your treatment done so that we can make sure you're safe before we release you home. We might do some additional blood draws. When we do these research blood draws, what it's telling us a lot of times is we're looking for what is the drug doing in the body? How long is it staying in the body? So you might wonder, if you're asked to participate in a clinical trial, it may include something called pharmacokinetics. So pharmacokinetics, PKs, that's what we call it for short. But this is basically us taking blood to see how long does the drug last in the body? How long does it stay? This tells us a lot about how frequently we need to give treatments to make sure it's continuously being effective. But it means sometimes that you're getting a blood draw before you take a dose of drug, after 1 hour, 2 hours, a few days. Not all trials incorporate these blood assessments, but some do. This would all be explained to you if you were considering participation in a clinical trial, and we can talk a little bit later about study design and how trials might think about being designed to be conducive to patient participation. But the short answer is trials can take more time. So what are the potential side effects? So different treatments are going to have different potential side effects. Some we know and some we don't. That's why we're in a clinical trial setting. Whatever we do know about the potential side effects, we're going to tell you during the consent process. And the consent is a process, right? So consent starts as soon as your provider or physician tells you about the potential to participate in a clinical trial, and it doesn't end until you stop. But there is also a form. And we call it a form, and we use that term loosely because it's usually a really long set of pages, and it can be 25 to 30 pages long, so it can be quite overwhelming. But what we're doing in that form is we're trying to tell you everything we know about what's going to happen, what you're going to be asked to do, and specifically about the risks that we know exist. But also during your participation in the trial, we're going to be asking you all the time about all sorts of side effects. How are you feeling today? If you say, well, I was nauseous yesterday, we're going to say, right, what time did that start? How significant was it? Did you have any vomiting with it? When did it stop? Are you better today? We're going to ask you a whole bunch of more detailed questions, because what we're doing is we're collecting all of this information. We're putting it in a system that's going to go back to the study sponsor, and then they're going to be able to look at it all across all of the different patients who are participating. And that's going to help us understand what the risks are and what the real side effects are of the treatment. So what are the costs, and will insurance cover if I participate in a clinical trial? So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, oncology clinical trials, cancer clinical trials, there tend to be a lot of things that overlap. If you're participating in a clinical trial, you're still going to see your doctor. You're still going to come here. You're still going to get an infusion potentially. So there's a lot of things that are the same. Those things, generally speaking, will be billed to your insurance, just like they would if you weren't on a trial. But oftentimes with clinical trials, the investigational treatment will be provided. So it'll be provided free of charge. That won't be billed to your insurance. All those research blood draws that I was telling you about, which don't exist in every trial, but if they do, those would all be billed to the study. None of that would be billed to you. What's really important is that you ask questions. We have excellent financial counselors at our cancer center who are very familiar with how we manage our clinical trials. And we and our coordinators and the people that you'd be working with and thinking about participation, and then that consent form I was telling you about, will also tell you a little about what costs you may be responsible for and what costs are going to be provided by the study or covered by the study. So will I get placebo? So this is a big concern of a lot of patients. It's completely understandable. And the short answer is no. In cancer clinical trials, we're always giving you treatment for your disease, but then you're going to see me kind of like walk that back a minute. So the more detailed responses is that we do sometimes do placebo-controlled trials, but what's extremely important to understand is that if you have cancer, we are never going to not treat your cancer. If there is a treatment for your cancer, you should not be asked to participate in a trial that randomizes you or puts you on an arm that would give you no treatment. If there is a treatment, we want you to get treatment. So the only scenarios where we might do something with placebo is, I talked a little earlier about some of our trials in that phase 3 setting are looking at combinations. So we're looking at combining the investigational treatment with the standard of care. So in those cases, some patients may get standard of care plus investigational treatment, and other patients may get just standard of care. And they may or may not have it with a placebo. So they might just know, hey, I got randomized to the standard of care. I'm not getting that investigational treatment. And other times we might design the trial so they don't know which one they're getting. That's really the most common scenario where there might be a placebo with respect to a cancer clinical trial. The only other type that would be a good example would be, let's say we're doing a trial for the prevention of cancer. So you don't have cancer, maybe you have a genetic tendency toward cancer, you have something that might show you're higher risk. But there's really nothing that is out there that's FDA approved or approved by anybody to prevent that cancer. We might be thinking about a pretty low toxicity supplement that we might think might have some activity in preventing cancer. That could be a scenario where you might get that supplement or nothing, right? Because the usual care is nothing. And so those are the scenarios in which placebo are used, and we use them very, very carefully and sparingly in cancer clinical trials. So are trials for patients with no other options? That's another common question. And I would say no. We have trials for all stages of disease. So you might be invited to join a clinical trial even if you haven't had any prior treatment. We also have trials that are looking at screening, that are looking at prevention, as I mentioned. So trials really aren't for patients where you're just at the end of the line. Now, patients who have exhausted all of the standard treatments may seek out a clinical trial to prolong their time, and that's perfectly acceptable as well. And we do those types of trials too. But there's also patients where there may be a standard treatment, but we just don't think it works as well as we like, and so we're trying other things to see if we can get something that works more effectively. So what if the standard of care changes while on trial? I'm going to answer this more broadly. If anything changes while you're on study, that we, the provider, our site, the study, what we call the study sponsor, whoever designed the trial, or the institutional review board feels like might alter your decision about participating in the trial, you're going to be informed of that change. So that could be there's a new standard of care. It could be there's a new identified risk that's impacting patients. Anything that changes like that, we're going to tell you about while you're on study. And we're going to do it in both an informal and a formal way. Sometimes we find things out before we have a chance to formally modify our informed consent document and all of that. But if it's going to really impact your safety or your wellness, we may verbally tell you about it right now. Then we're going to redesign all of our documents and we're going to give you something in writing later. Other times it might be something that we just have already prepared in writing. But you should always ask for your research team for that information in your informed consent. So why does it matter if I participate or if you participate? So representation in clinical trials matters. And, you know, this is something at the Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center, I think we've always been very aware of, and we've always monitored very closely that we have patients enrolled to our trials that represent the population of cancer patients that we see. But I think in the last few years with COVID, it's gotten a lot more airtime, right? A lot of people are talking about this, and it really does matter. We need to know whether drugs work in the patients who have the disease. If we don't know, if we only study a treatment in one segment of the population, but a whole other segment of the population is also affected by that disease, that drug's going to get approved and it's going to get used in the whole population. But the bottom line is we then don't know really how it might work in that other population that wasn't included in the clinical trials. So the consequences of underrepresentation in clinical trials, and particularly racially and ethnically minoritized individuals, are frequently left out of clinical trials. This leaves them underrepresented in the study of these important treatments, and it perpetuates healthcare inequities and healthcare disparities. And most importantly, it's a failure to detect harm, right? We don't know if a drug is going to have a negative impact in you if no one who looks like you, talks like you, walks like you was included in the clinical trial that tested the drug. So this is really important. So at the Simmons Comprehensive Cancer Center, we do clinical trials just about everywhere that we see patients. Our clinical research office has staff at UT Southwestern, here in Dallas at our primary campus, but also at our regional clinics in Fort Worth, in Richardson, Plano, and at Redbird. We also have a dedicated clinical trials team at Parkland. So we work really closely with Parkland to open as many trials as we can. And at Children's Medical Center, they have a dedicated team as well that works with our pediatric oncologists to deliver clinical trials to our pediatric patients, our children, and our families. So we're here to guide you. So the journey of cancer is hard enough without added decision-making and the complexity of considering a clinical trial. And at the Simmons Cancer Center, we have several individuals who will help you along your way to a decision if you're approached or interested in participating in a clinical trial. Traditionally, it's included your care team, your provider, your physician, our clinical research coordinators, and our research nurses. The clinical research coordinator or research nurse really does act as your primary contact from the time you're invited until you make a decision or your trial participation ends. But more recently, we've added more people to our care team and have expanded those resources. And so I just want to take a minute to introduce you to our clinical trials navigators. So over the last 4 years, we've expanded our clinical trials navigation to 4 individuals. At this point, we hope to expand it more. But this is a group of lay navigators whose entire job is helping our patients understand what it means to join a clinical trial, helping answer their questions, being a liaison between the patient and our research teams and the other care providers at our institution, and also helping provide expertise and resources to help break down barriers to participation in clinical trials. So barriers to participation could be cultural, they could be personal, they could be family related, they can also be practical. How am I going to travel for all those extra appointments? How do I pay for the food that I need to eat? You know, when I have to, if I have to go and travel to UT Southwestern and stay in a hotel? How do I pay for that? All of those things. Our clinical trial navigators are there to sort of help our patients through that. And they end up being a huge resource, not just to the patient, but also to our clinical research teams. So we always like to say, if you're joining a clinical trial, you're not losing anyone. You're keeping your physician, you're keeping your nurse practitioner, your PA, your clinic nurses, all the staff that cares for you at our site, and we are just like adding exponentially to that team. So we're adding our research nurses, our coordinators, and our navigators to your care team. Some additional programs that we have available at the Simmons Cancer Center. We have a patient financial reimbursement program. This is funded by the Cancer Prevention Research Institute of Texas and executed in partnership with the Lazarex Cancer Foundation. And this program is a financial assistance program to assist patients with non-medical expenses associated with participation in treatment trials. So specifically trials that are treating cancer. Those non-medical expenses, as I mentioned, would be like childcare, transportation, lodging, food, all those things that kind of add up when you're in a clinical trial. And even some patients who might not think that they need any assistance at first, we know that there's a lot of financial toxicity to participating in clinical trials and in cancer care. And so sometimes those financial situations can change, and this just provides a really good resource for our patients. In addition, as I mentioned before, we have a dedicated team of clinical researchers at Parkland Health and Hospital System, and we try to open as many of our trials as we can at Parkland. But sometimes with our early phase trials, particularly, we like to keep those close to us. So we may only open those trials at one location, so we can make sure that we're monitoring those patients extra carefully, and we only have things going on sort of at one place at a time. And in that scenario, we actually have a pilot project where we're looking at the potential for transferring patients to UT Southwestern for participation in a clinical trial, if that's the right thing for them and that's what they want to do. But this is funded by the Stand Up to Cancer grant, and is a unique program that we've been partnering with Parkland to execute this year. I want to participate in a clinical trial, but no one's asked me. So we know that the #1 reason people don't participate in clinical trials is because no one asks. And that's just the sad truth. Even in a center like ours, where we are really trying to approach all patients about participation in clinical trials, it's busy. We might not remember that we have a certain trial open or closed and what status it's in, and there's just a lot going on. Or you might be being seen somewhere else for your cancer, and just no one's really talked to you about clinical trials. So we have some resources on our website, and again, you're going to get these next week, so you can kind of click on this link when you get it and tool around with it, look at it. It's really neat. You can search for a study. You can click on whatever disease. So this study finder webpage is actually not unique just to cancer. It has trials links for all different kinds of diseases that we're doing at UT Southwestern. But you can also click on cancer. You can click on prostate. You can click on breast, and you can see what trials are available. So some trials that we're particularly excited about. There's a bunch of trials on the next few slides. I am not going to go through all of these today. I'm just going to highlight a few. You're going to get these links here on the page, where it's underlined. When you get the resources, you'll be able to click on that, and it'll actually take you either to the study finder or to clinicaltrials.gov, where you can see more about the trial specifically. But some of the trials on this page we're really excited about. This very first one in breast cancer. This study actually itself is almost close to enrollment. We're almost done with it, but because of the response rates that we're seeing in that early phase trial, we now have a grant, and we're going to be launching a phase 2 of the same. So we're really excited about that. In cervical cancer, we've just opened what I mentioned earlier, an investigator-initiated trial. So one of our physicians developed this trial in cervical cancer. In head and neck cancer, we have trials using nanoparticles in this fluorescence imaging, so that the surgeon, when they're in there looking at your tumor, can actually see where your tumor starts and ends, and they're looking at a clinical trial in that. So that's really neat. And then in pediatric cancer, as I mentioned, we have lots of trials open in all of these areas. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the newest, latest and greatest that we've opened and that are opening for our patients, our families, and our children. Other trials to check out, as I mentioned, prostate cancer, kidney cancer, bladder cancer, multiple myeloma. This is not exhaustive. We have trials in all different kinds of cancer. I encourage you to check out the Study Finder website or click on any of these links when you get this webinar and you can see more about it. Also, just want to remind you in that very kind of third slide where we talked about CAR T, there's a link there too, so you can learn a little bit more about that. But you know, what happens if I find a trial, then who do I reach out to? So in our Study Finder website, if you actually click the link to email, interest, or call, this is where it's going to take you. But our cancer answer line isn't just for clinical trials. So at the Cancer Center, we have this cancer answer line available to the community and our patients when they just want more information about cancer in general, or maybe they have a patient, a friend, a loved one, and they're just not sure how to direct them. So this is a phone number you can call or email. Any cancer clinical research inquiries that come through this number get routed to me or my team, and then we route those to the right person to get back in touch with you. And that really brings me to the end of my talk. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions. Awesome. I don't know, Alex, do you want me to keep sharing my slides or should I open it back up?
I think you could probably minimize your slides if you want, so we can see your face best. But we have a question. So the first question, oh, now my screen changed. Sorry, give me 1 second. The first question is artificial intelligence, AI, starting to yield more effective associations in the mass data sets on cancer research to speed up those clinical applications?
So AI, this is getting a little beyond my expertise, but I would say we are really hopeful about what artificial intelligence can do in the research environment to exploit sort of the data that we've already collected. And we have several groups here on campus that are looking at AI and how it could be used both practically and maybe in clinical trials to help advance the care for our patients.
And you touched on this a little bit, but we'll see maybe if you want to add some more about placebos. So the question is, do most trials use placebos? And if so, do most patients choose not to enroll in the trial because they would not want to receive a non-effective placebo?
Right. So that's a really good question. I would say in cancer, most trials do not use placebo. So it is more rare than in cancer clinical trials, especially because we know, again, our patients are sick. We want them all to get treatment. I would say that more often patients, so we do have trials even when we're not using placebos, and I kind of mentioned this, that might have investigational treatment is one of the arms of the trial, and then the standard treatment is the other arm. So that means that patients are are basically going to be assigned, usually randomly when you consent, and some will get the investigational treatment and some will just get the standard treatment. And it does impact the patient's decision. It really depends. These are conversations you have to have with your provider, with your research team, with your family, with your friends, and they're hard decisions to make. But we have had patients who say, I don't really want to participate because I might not get the investigational treatment, which is what I really want to get. And there is some of that that's not, they don't control. Now that kind of randomization is unique to phase 3 trials. So if you're participating in a phase 1 or phase 2 trial, as I mentioned earlier, you're generally going to get the investigational treatment. So even when we think about what's common or uncommon, it always depends on the trial, but I would say it's a smaller percentage of what we're doing here that are those randomized, I'm going to get treatment or I'm not going to get treatment, or not get the investigational treatment trials.
All right. And this question is about insurance companies. Are insurance companies notified when a patient enrolls in a clinical trial?
Yes, generally speaking, through our authorization process that we do with all patients who get any treatment here at UT Southwestern or the Simmons Cancer Center, we're going to try to pre-authorize whatever we need to do your cancer care. And so if you are participating in a clinical trial, particularly if there's one that, some things are covered and some things aren't, your insurance company likely will be notified. In addition, Medicare requires that we notify them. So even if we have have a patient on a clinical trial that is a Medicare patient, Medicare says it's okay to bill Medicare for some aspects of clinical trials, but we have to tell them. So we have a little signal that we send them when we send the bill that says this is a research related, but appropriate to bill to Medicare procedure.
All right. And this next question asks you to go a little bit farther into the range of phases of clinical trials. You talked about that, but can you talk about across cancer diagnoses? Are there clinical trials for every type of cancer?
Generally speaking, there are. I would say within certain types of cancer, like, early stages of certain types of cancer may have really, really effective standard treatments. And so there's not that many trials because what's already out there is working just fine. But in oncology, especially, we have to bring drugs to trial anytime we change how we're using them in a significant way. So this means I might have a treatment for breast cancer that is FDA approved in breast cancer. And now I think, there might be some signal that this is going to work in lung cancer. I have to start over. I actually have to put that drug into a phase 1 trial for those lung cancer patients, even if it's something that we've been using in other patients for a really long time. Similarly, if we're going to combine drugs, so maybe I know that a drug works in lung cancer, and now I want to see if I combine it with this other FDA approved drug, if it works even better. I have to do a trial for that, and it always starts at the phase 1. What we have seen more about in the last, I would say 5 or 10 years, are adaptive clinical trial design and phase 1/2 trials. So the attempt here is that every time you design a new trial, as you would imagine, all of the regulatory hurdles you have to sort of overcome to get that trial open, it takes a really long time. So how can we be efficient? Well, if we have a trial design that allows us to go straight from one place to another place, as long as we know we're meeting sort of the metrics we've set for ourselves, then that's sort of like one less or many less regulatory steps. Adaptive trial design, basket and umbrella trials is what you'll hear about. And so a basket trial or an umbrella trial is one where we might have many arms and we're taking them in and out. So we're testing a lot of things in one protocol. So one patient goes on arm A, and that's one set of treatments. And then at the arm B is a completely different set of treatments for a completely different set of patients. So there's a lot of things that are happening in the scientific world to try to make things more efficient. Sometimes it can make things just quite complicated. But yes, we're trying to do things to speed it up. But in oncology, you pretty much have to start over every time you're doing something new. What that does mean, though, I will say, is just because you're participating in a phase 1 trial doesn't necessarily mean that you're the first person who's ever had that drug. It could mean that that drug is well tolerated in many different types of patients or diseases. And now it's the first time we're testing it on your type of disease. So, in some ways it can lend itself to a little bit of a comfort level when you're thinking about participating in a phase 1 study that could otherwise be a little maybe anxiety provoking.
So I think this next question kind of piggybacks on that. Would it be clinically reasonable for a patient to seek a trial before exhausting current standard of treatments?
Absolutely. I think patients should ask about clinical trials at every step of the way. And we even get calls from patients, our current patients, saying, what about this trial? And we'll kind of try to connect back with the provider and let them know, hey, this patient called, they're really interested in a clinical trial. Not sure if you've talked to them yet about this. I think patients should always be asking about the potential for clinical trials. It doesn't mean that it's always the right thing to do. That's a personal decision and a decision between the patient and your physician, your provider, and you kind of given all the information, what might be better or worse. Because again, just because it's a clinical trial, we don't always know if it's the best thing. But as an NCI designated cancer center, I would say that our philosophy is that until there's a cure, there's a trial, right? So it's always relevant to ask. You can always say no. You can always change your mind. even if you're already on the trial, you can change your mind and come off the trial, and it's not going to impact your care or your ability to get care here. You don't have to be on a clinical trial to come to UT Southwestern or to come to the Simmons Cancer Center. And if you come here for a trial, you don't have to stay on it in order to stay here.
So there's two good questions about kind of staying on the trial. If a trial treatment works for me, would I be allowed to continue on it indefinitely?
That's a really good question. So especially in the later phases of clinical trials, drugs are moving on to the approval process, hopefully. Some drugs may not. So there's two types of patients, right? There's the patient who does really well, or there's a few types, I guess. But there's patients who do really well on treatments that maybe don't work in the general population, so they don't end up going all the way to FDA approval. That can be hard. That can be a challenge, because obviously at some point that company is not going to be working on that drug anymore. We do try to keep patients on the treatment that's working as long as we possibly can. Sometimes what it means is if the trial is done, we may turn you over to what we call a compassionate use program. So that means we get special permission from the FDA to use that non-FDA approved treatment for a patient who's not participating in a clinical trial. That allows us to close the clinical trial, do all the things we need to do with our data, but you keep getting the treatment. It's very rare, but we've had scenarios where we've had to change things up, but most often you'd be allowed to stay on it as long as it's effective, and as long as we have the drug available.
So here's
Did I miss the second part of that question?
Well, I'm giving it to you now. So I broke it apart for it. So if that new treatment that is gleaned from a trial is as effective as current standard of care, but not significantly better, but has significantly less cost, will it go forward because of cost?
So there's cost. And so I was thinking you were going to get to side effects, because that's kind of the easy question, right? If something is just as effective as the more toxic, what we consider more toxic drug, maybe not better, maybe not worse, but it's less toxic, then that would be a drug we'd probably really want to go forward with, right? If it's simply that it's lower cost, which that would be a challenge. New drugs with old drugs tend to be cheaper than new drugs. So I don't know exactly when that might come up. But I wouldn't say that it would be a barrier. I think what we've seen in recent years is that the FDA will approve things that are effective. And so we end up sometimes, like you saw at that first, like third slide where I showed you all the immune therapies, and there are like several different types of drugs. All of those drugs may be used in similar ways, and they're all FDA approved. So the FDA doesn't just like say, okay, there's this one thing for this, and that's all ever what it's going to be. But I do think, to your point, cost should be something that we are paying close attention to, because financial toxicity is a real thing, and it's something that our patients face, that I think sometimes, as you know, the broader spectrum doesn't pay close enough attention to.
So here's your side effect questions. You beat us to these. How do you isolate side effects caused by the investigational drug if the patient is also on standard of care normal treatment? And would we anticipate seeing side effects mainly in phase 1 of trials?
So that's a really excellent question. So how do you isolate side effects from one treatment to the other? The answer is it's really hard. I don't do it. My research team doesn't do it. That's something we leave to our physician providers, and our advanced practice providers, our nurse practitioners who are delegated on the study to do that. But it is hard. It's challenging. When it really comes down to the data, I'll tell you, we have sort of a tier of unrelated, probably related, or not, like unrelated, unlikely, probably, possibly. There's a huge scale. And the answer is it's really hard to tell. But we have to look at two things. So we have to look at all the other circumstances of the patient, what we know about that standard treatment. If we think, yes, this is a common side effect of the standard treatment, but maybe it's acting a little bit worse, in this combination, or we just know it's a common side effect of both, then we would say that it's probably or possibly related. And those are actual terms that we use when we report on the data. And then when the sponsor gets all the data from all the patients who participated, that's really really where they can tease out a little bit better what side effects are looking like they were signaled toward the investigational treatment versus standard treatment versus the cancer, right? Because your cancer causes side effects too. I think I lost the last part of that question. There was one other aspect of that question that I didn't get to in that response.
Do we see side effects in phase 1 trials mainly?
We'll see side effects in all phases of the studies, really. And especially phase 1 studies, interestingly, when you start out, the first dose of the drug that's given to the first patient is usually kind of a lower dose of the drug, because we want to be really careful and make sure that we're not, giving too much at once, and that we can monitor for those side effects. As you get into phase 2 and phase 3, you're giving the dose of the drug that you anticipate you'll be giving always. We know that, drugs that we're using to fight cancer often have toxicities. And so, even those targeted therapies, which might not be as toxic, you still will see some signals of like, skin rash is the common one from some of the therapies because of the things that they're targeting. So very few cancer-related drugs are without side effects. So you will see them in all phases. But again, we're following and monitoring really closely.
This next question is a great question about how much of this falls on the patient and how much is on the provider to be directed to trials. So how does my provider know that I'm a candidate for a trial, or should I be doing research for trials and notifying my team?
Yeah. And, I always think, patients are your best advocate, right? When you're interested in trials. However, at our cancer center, we also are trying to, all of our providers, as well as our research teams, are screening, kind of pre-screening and looking for patients for the clinical trials that we have open. So hopefully if you come here, your provider is always thinking about clinical trials when you're ready to transition treatment, right? So either you're newly diagnosed, or maybe the treatment you're on isn't working, and so we're ready to change something up. We hope that all providers are thinking about clinical trials, but always never hesitate to ask about clinical trials. We're all human, and we all have a lot of information, all of us, including the patient, that we're processing at any given time. And so it's just, I think we're both responsible for making sure that we get you to that place, if that's where you want to be.
So this next question is, does the study finder include studies that UT Southwestern is not participating in, but that may be available to another institution?
It doesn't. So the study finder website that I included the link for is only studies that are currently active enrolling at UT Southwestern and active enrolling, nationally. However, within Study Finder, when you do find a study, you can click on it. It'll take you to a website called clinicaltrials.gov. All studies anywhere that are interventional in nature. So what does interventional mean? So it can mean treatment, prevention, doing something different. It's a trial, are required to be registered on clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov is working hard to make itself more user-friendly. It can be a little difficult to navigate, but that's where you can always go to find trials that are open at many different places. In addition, there are a lot of different areas out there in nonprofits that are trying to work on finders for patients and for providers, right? So like if I'm a provider and I want a trial for my patient, but I don't have anything I can offer them here, where can I go to see what they might qualify for that might be nearby? So there are those places, those web pages out there. I don't have any of those resources off the top of my head, but our study finder is just trials that are open here at UT Southwestern.
And so to that point for UT Southwestern trials, if I go to Redbird, can I enroll in a study that is or is not available at Redbird?
Right. So in the Cancer Center, we have dedicated research teams at Redbird, Richardson, Fort Worth, and then here at our primary Dallas site over on Harry Hines. So the short answer is yes, you can think about clinical trials regardless of where you're being seen. Our clinical trials have a lot of logistics, so our study team is going to know, where can we do your treatment? Can we do your treatment at Redbird? We hope so, and we're going to try to do it out there. If we can't, then we may be able to do some aspects of the trial out at Redbird, and we may bring you to Dallas to do some other aspects of the trial. So we do our best to bring as much as we can, and if we can bring the entire thing, including all the infusions, out to the regional clinics where you're being seen or Parkland, we do that. But in the case that we can't, then we may see like, well, maybe you can get all of your lab work done out there. Even if you have some of those research blood draws, we have a research team that can help you with that. And maybe you have to come, over here to Harry Hines and get one other thing done.
A couple other questions about phases. Can you join a clinical trial at any phase, or do you have to start at a phase 1 of a clinical trial?
And so that's, I touched on this just a little bit. The trial phase that you're asked to join is going to be the phase of the drug, the phase of the treatment that it's in right then. So you as a participant, you might be asked to join or offered a phase 3 clinical trial or a phase 2. Generally speaking, the investigational treatment's only going to be in one phase at a time. So it's the timing that's going to be dependent on what phase you might be offered. But you aren't moving through the phases. So you do not always have to be on a phase 1 study before you can go on a phase 2. That phase is just in reference to where the treatment is in its course of sort of testing and understanding how it works and whether it works.
Sorry, when does the trial stop? When do researchers end a trial?
So individual trials are going to be designed to stop at pre-specified points. So they'll generally be designed to enroll a certain number of patients, and then they will be designed to follow that number of patients through a certain period of time. So for example, a trial might be designed to enroll 250 patients, and we might say we want to follow each patient through 5 years of survival. So in that case, once the 250th patient is enrolled, then the enrollment stops. And that patient, when that last patient gets to that 5-year, then the study stops. Your participation in a study is going to be based on where you are in that space. So you might have been patient number 3 in that scenario, and you may be at your 5 years far sooner than that 250th patient is. And so your treatment and your trial participation is going to stop wherever that predetermined place is for you. And that's something that will be defined in the informed consent document. Something else that we've tried to implement here is providing our patients at each sort of transition phase, because you will inevitably transition from the treatment to follow-up. So if the treatment, let's say, is designed to give you treatment for 5 cycles, and then at the end of 5 cycles, we stop, and now you're in follow-up. So we're just looking to see how you're doing long-term. We want to communicate with you. We're communicating with you throughout, but we want to remind you at that point, like, hey, thank you so much for your participation. Now you're going to transition to this follow-up phase. Here's how we're going to follow you. You may or may not still see your research team regularly. It sort of depends on how that follow-up looks and is designed from the trial. Some trials will just say, all we're doing is following you long-term for survival. So that may mean that we can do that by just looking at your medical records. But we want to make that transition so that it's clear for patients. We've heard feedback in the past that patients feel like they just kind of got lost. Like, it's like I'm done and poof, everybody disappears. Am I still being followed? Do I need to worry about the timing of these visits? And so that's an area where we're trying to improve our communication. But again, in your informed consent form, it should tell you exactly how long you're expected to maintain follow-up appointments and do the things and report back to the study team, and when your trial participation ends. Something else that I think we are trying to do better, and by we, I mean both here at the Simmons Cancer Center, but also broadly in the clinical trial community, is report results. That clinicaltrials.gov website page that I mentioned requires results reporting. So it requires us to put those in, but those can often be kind of complicated looking and hard to understand if you're just looking through all this data. And so more and more I'm seeing study sponsors come out with sort of letters that are geared to the patients and the people who participate in the trial to say, hey, here's what happened. here's what came of your participation in the trial. Either we moved it to FDA approval, we moved it to the next phase, or we didn't, whatever.
Okay, last question, I think, given our time. And it's an access question. Patients that don't have insurance, are they able to enroll in clinical trials?
So really yes, but clinical trials don't cover all of the costs of enrollment in many cases, and in fact, probably in most cases. We do occasionally have trials, depending on the phase in which they're in, where study sponsors will, or the type of treatment, where study sponsors will cover most of the cost of participating, most of the things that are required of the trial, if not all. But most of our clinical trials do involve some aspect that is not covered by the study, and those procedures and tests are still required. So in that case, your insurance coverage, where you're able to see your physician, is really driven sort of by you, and by where your insurance can be accepted. Of course, in Dallas County, we have Parkland. And as I mentioned, we have a robust, oncology service at Parkland, and we try to open our trials at Parkland as well. So that's an option for Dallas County residents. But at UT Southwestern, we would have to take a look at those individuals. But I think the take-home message there is that clinical trials, we will get inquiries from time to time saying, I lost my insurance, I need a trial. We don't want you to feel like you have to, look for a trial because you think all the costs are going to be covered. That often isn't the case. And it's also not the reason we want you to feel like you have to join a trial. But that's something that is a challenge in cancer trials.
Erin, we are perfectly prompt. It's 1 o'clock, so we'll wrap up here. There's lots of great thank yous in the chat for all of the information. And I extend the same to you. Thank you for being with us today and covering everything and making clinical trials really digestible and understandable. I think we got a lot of great information. So thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And remember, you'll get an email with the recording and the slides sometime next week. So keep an eye out for that. Have a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much.